Hello and welcome back. This is the week 12 lecture. So today I would like us to finish Hope Leslie. We'll cover volume 2, which is basically the second half of the novel. So I'm not quite sure how far along we are since we got rid of last week's discussion post. So even if you're not quite finished with the book yet, by the end of this week, that's okay. Just keep working. It is a relatively lengthy text. It's about 370 pages if you got the edition that I ordered, and I hope you do, because as I mentioned last week, I hope you do have this edition, because I want you to read the critical intro at some point. You might want to wait until you're finished with the book. And also we have some good explanatory endnotes that you might notice. So the end of the book is comprised largely of the notes. A lot of these are filling in sort of historical details or sort of explaining some of Sedgwick's references, which is always helpful. So it's long, I know, and if we're still reading it in week 13, that's okay, because there's an announcement. I'm not going to talk about it here, but there's an announcement that I've made in the week 12 module that I think will make most of us happy, and it should simplify things here at the end of the semester. So we should be able to get through this book because it's the last big major text that we'll need to read. So just keep working on it, and you can, of course, come to this lecture. If you're watching this lecture before you finish the book, that's fine. But I will be revealing some spoilers. I'll be talking a little bit about the end, the conclusion, so you can also wait and watch this once you finally have finished the book. So just a few things to notice as we work our way through volume 2. A couple of these things I mentioned last week, but also a few new things to consider this week. So I want you to kind of pay attention to Sedgwick's pacing and her action. So I kind of mentioned this a little bit last week. I find her prose, for the most part, to be pretty modern, at least relative to her time period and compared to a lot of her contemporaries. I think she has a pretty good gift for plot construction, sort of moving things along relatively briskly, keeping the action moving. I think, again, notice her pacing, because even though, a lot happens here. We have a lot of subplots, and you might find a lot of the plot developments to be pretty improbable or melodramatic at times, but I don't think we can accuse Sedgwick of being boring. There's certainly a lot of events happening and a lot of intrigue. And I think she handles the subplots and the large cast of characters pretty well. And I just want you to compare what we see here with what we've seen in a lot of our previous texts. Think about Wieland, think about Hiko Tenkettle, which of course we read right before Hope Leslie. Just think about the styles that we encountered, the writing styles in those books. There were a lot of elements to like in those books, but think about the way a lot of action was delivered. I think Brown delivered some pretty exciting action at times, but we talked about kind of the 18th century style, the old-fashioned diction that really characterizes Brown, the sort of almost ambiguous elliptical way that he describes a lot of things, this kind of evasive quality. And then with Hiko Tenkettle, we saw that with the kind of neoclassical style that was being employed there, we noticed that there really wasn't much of a commitment to realism. And while things definitely happened, battles were fought, people were kidnapped, there was actually a fair amount of action. People were jumping out of windows and running around at various times, but a lot of that action was delivered to the audience in summary form. I pointed that out a few weeks back. A lot of it was a lot of the action was summarized kind of after the fact and sort of presented in a kind of condensed sort of version. So, we've had these kind of more old-fashioned styles. And again, I've kind of explained some of those styles and why they were still in fashion at the end of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century. And Sedgwick is not totally different from those other authors. She also borrows from a lot of older forms and styles, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. But I do think we see more of a commitment to realism. You know, a lot of people think that Sedgwick is kind of anticipating, and I mentioned this last week, she's anticipating some future developments in 19th century U.S. literature. More of a push towards realism, less of an interest in kind of rehashing older styles, and more kind of forging ahead to new techniques. So we're going to get a little bit of that here, but at the same time, Sedgwick wasn't exactly a revolutionary, so she is borrowing some older forms, and there's still this kind of moral instruction that I think comes through, and that was a very kind of old-fashioned thing that literature was supposed to do during this time period. So Sedgwick is not departing from all of these older traditions and forms, but she is doing more new stuff and maybe more modern stuff compared to some of our other recent texts. So let's think about that. Let's also continue to think about our three heroines. And I mentioned this sort of trio last time, this trio of strong female characters. So obviously that includes Hope, Magawiska, and Esther. And I want to talk a little bit more about Esther Downing today. We met her in Volume 1. We know that she's good friends with Hope, and she's a part of this kind of weird love triangle that I mentioned briefly last week, but we really see it develop in Volume 2 between Hope and Everil and Esther. So Esther's interesting. She's not as developed probably as the other two heroines, but I want to come back to her a little bit today because at the end of the book, we sort of see her character make some relatively unconventional choices for the time period, not just the time period in which the book was written. Remember, the book was published in 1827, but remember also that we're going back further in time in terms of our actual historical setting. So the book is set in like the mid 17th century, so the middle of the 1600s, a very early period in English, colonialism in North America. So for that era, what we ultimately see Esther sort of opt to do is a bit unconventional and interesting, and it connects to Sedgwick. Sedgwick as a person. So we can talk about that a little bit as well. We'll talk about Sir Philip. As I mentioned, there's some ties to older forms, and we see a lot of that through the character of Sir Philip. We'll talk about that love triangle that he tries to kind of get in on, but he's wooing, attempting to seduce Hope, but she's not interested. He's the villain. He's the bad guy. We'll talk more about him. He's very much a stock character. He's very much a character type that would have been very familiar to readers of this time period. So we'll cover all of that, but I just want to spend a brief moment on a couple of relatively minor characters who I mentioned last week. Mrs. Grafton, the aunt of Hope, who kind of lives with Hope, initially in the Fletcher household and then later in the Winthrop household in Boston. And also Master Craddock, who is like the tutor. He lives with the family because he provides, academic instruction to the children, and he has a kind of, close friendship kind of relationship with Hope. But these are two comic characters, Craddock and Mrs. Grafton. They are largely here for comic relief, so they're not super important, although they do play roles in various plot developments, but they're not among the most important characters. But I do just want to point out that there is some comedy here. There is some levity in the midst of all of these heightened emotions and, very momentous events. So I just flagged a couple of passages. We don't need to spend a lot of time on these, really. But if you look towards at the very end of Volume 1, in this edition, it's page 173. Kind of a fun exchange between the two characters. They're often interacting in kind of fun ways. They're both kind of elderly. And remember, Mrs. Grafton, in addition to being funny, she also kind of represents sort of a different perspective and a reminder that that Hope's family is not really Puritan, right? Like her father was not a Puritan, and Mrs. Grafton, I believe, is the sister of Hope's deceased father. And remember, Hope's mother was supposed to marry William Fletcher, Everill's father, and she kind of wanted to live the Puritan lifestyle with William in New England, but her villainous father prevents her from doing that. So remember, her family, they're royalists. They're loyal to the English king, whereas William Fletcher gravitates more towards supporters of the parliamentarians, and many of those supporters also happen to be dissenters from the Church of England. So this is a lot of history, a lot of English history that we don't need to be experts on, but it does matter for this novel because Fletcher represents this kind of love of liberty, and he's anti-monarch, he's anti-royalty, and he also subscribes, not the Church of England was not the same as Catholicism, of course. England had broken away from the Catholic Church several hundred years earlier, but they had more ceremony and sort of pomp, and they were a little bit more closely tied in some ways to older Catholic traditions. So dissenters, not just Puritans, but like Quakers, Methodists, Baptists, all of those dissenting branches of Protestantism, in early America, they would have been privileged and sort of, championed more than, Anglicans. Who would have been viewed as too close to Catholics. And we kind of get a little bit of that from our Puritan characters in this novel. They would have viewed the Church of England as being too close to Catholicism for comfort. So the dissenting groups are privileged. The people who preferred the Parliament over the king, they are privileged. And many of them are depicted as coming over to America. That's kind of William Fletcher's story. They want to get away from the oppression of the royalists. They want to come over and start a new godly nation. Of course, part of that means taking the land away from the Native Americans. So what we mentioned last week is that Sedgwick is kind of threading this needle between, sort of celebrating the settlers, the kind of diversity of English settlers, while also being more frank about what happened to the Native Americans. So in some ways, Grafton, not so much Craddock, but definitely Mrs. Grafton kind of helps her with some of her larger thematic goals. But anyway, I just wanted to point out that these characters are kind of funny. So at the end of Volume 1, this is just a fun little exchange as the two of them are sort of, the setup here is that Hope is trying to get away from her elders to go and have this kind of clandestine meeting with Magawiska, something that she does a lot. She's often running to and fro, doing things kind of in secret, which brings her some chastisement and some real rebukes from the Puritan authorities, as we'll talk about more. But she always has a good reason for it, right? She's always trying to help in some way. So she's trying to slip away, and she asks Mr. Craddock to escort Mrs. Grafton home. And his response is, "Surely, surely," said the good man eagerly. "There is nothing you could ask me, Miss Hope, as you well know, be it ever so disagreeable, that I would not do." So he's inadvertently sort of insulting Mrs. Grafton by inadvertently suggesting that it would be disagreeable to escort her home, as her response indicates. "Thank you for nothing, Mr. Craddock," said the testy dame with a toss of her head. "You are over-civil, I think, tonight." So anyway, she goes on to tell Hope, "Oh, it's fine, you go off. Even though Mr. Craddock is blind at night, I'm sure he can still get me home safely." So it's, again, we're meant to laugh at these two characters, and I mentioned last week the letter. At one point, we even get a little bit of Miss Grafton's voice. We get a letter that she writes to Everil, where she's kind of just going on and on about kind of silly stuff. So they're kind of absurd, ridiculous characters that we are invited to laugh at. and they provide comic relief, which again was kind of typical of early novels. We would usually have one or two comic characters. They would often be schoolmasters or sort of elderly, sort of meddlesome old ladies. So again, these are kind of stock characters for like sentimental novels and other popular early novels of this, period. But we're also supposed to kind of, largely, I think, like the two characters and sort of think of them as ultimately being pretty good-hearted, in contrast to Janae, who's the evil housekeeper. And I'm pretty sure, so I looked up the name, and I believe it's the word for a Spanish horse. So that might be intentional. And she's also a stock character. I don't know if you guys remember Reuben and Rachel. There was a very minor character that appeared in volume 2, I think, of that book, Tabitha, who was sort of this really sort of mean, meddlesome housekeeper that kind of torments Rachel for a short duration when she's living, I think, abroad in England for a part of volume 2. This is a very common character in sentimental fiction. The sort of mean, meddlesome, sort of shrewish housekeeper character. Again, audiences would have recognized her, sort of very, very pious, but kind of hypocritical in her practice of religion, very sort of stern and harsh, and usually mean to the main female character, and often, again, kind of meddling in affairs and kind of misunderstanding things. Janae, in this book, plays a pretty important role to the plot, as we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to the end of Volume 2. So, she's an important character, but like Sir Philip, a villain, really. We're invited to dislike her and to view her as morally deficient, really. Despite all of her professions of Christianity, we're meant to see her and Sir Philip as kind of the villains. They are, in many ways, obstacles to the other characters' happiness. Whereas Grafton and Craddock are just fun comic figures who are also, I think, supposed to be, or they're meant to be, largely likable. So we have a big cast. Just kind of form some of your own opinions about all of these different characters. But to kind of come back to our main characters, if we're thinking about Hope, one thing you should really keep in mind, and it's largely true of Magawiska as well, we see both of these characters rebelling against Puritan authority. And we see it a lot in Volume 2. And in various ways, and the way the two characters rebel might be a little bit different. But remember, a lot of critics see Hope and Magawiska as kind of reflecting one another in certain ways, kind of being mirrors of one another in certain ways. They at least share certain admirable qualities. And remember, one of the larger projects that Sedgwick is taking part in here, she's trying to kind of argue for the overall humanity of Native Americans. Remember all the political sort of upheaval that's going on in the 1820s as Indian removal is sort of being contemplated, and there are all these lingering questions about what the U.S. government should do in relation to Native Americans. And Sedgwick is kind of weighing in here. She's not overtly political, and again, she is sort of adopting this middle ground approach, but part of what she's doing is kind of rehabilitating the image of Native Americans largely through Magawiska. There aren't any other well-developed Native American characters in the book. There are other characters. Monanato, her father, the chief, the Pequot chief, who's still kind of an enemy of the English, her brother, Oneko, who kind of shows up. He plays an important role in the plot, as we'll see towards the end, but he's not developed in any way, really. So, both Magawiska and Hope sort of defy authority in many ways. And Hope especially, we see her do it a lot in ways that are, maybe kind of minor to us in the eyes of modern readers. A lot of her rebellion mostly consists of speaking her mind and defending Native Americans, right? But she also defies certain rules and standards. So again, we're supposed to notice that, and she is, as a character, she is supposed to register as rebellious and pretty headstrong, and at times maybe even a little bit reckless. But she never does anything morally wrong. So notice in Volume 2, a lot of the action, a lot of the plot developments really hinge on Hope being rebellious and kind of getting into some trouble as a result, but often people fear that things are worse than they are. Like a lot of her she's always out at night, kind of doing things that are sometimes shrouded in secrecy. And at various times, she is spotted alone with Sir Philip. So this should kind of remind us a little bit of the coquette. It was inappropriate, for an unmarried woman during this time period, particularly in a Puritan society, to be sort of in the company of someone like Sir Philip, even though he's pretending to be a Puritan, right? Just for them to be alone together sort of causes suspicion. It doesn't matter if they're just walking and chatting, but again, he's putting himself in her path, just like Sanford often did with Eliza. And when, Everell spots the two of them together, he often fears the worst. And at some point, at various points, he thinks that maybe they're a couple, right? Or that Hope is interested in Sir Philip. So a lot of plot developments kind of hinge on her conduct coming under suspicion. But then there's always a justification for it. And oftentimes she's trying to save or assist her Native American friends. So just notice some repetition and some of the parallels that we see between Volume 1 and Volume 2. So remember in Volume 1, Hope gets into some trouble when she tries to spring Nalima, the elderly Native American medicine woman type character. She tries to spring her from jail because Nalima was wrongfully accused of basically being a witch, practicing witchcraft. Remember that interesting scene I talked about last week when she cures Craddock's snakebite? But she's practicing native medicine, and she's explaining aspects of her own Native American culture to Hope. And Hope is intrigued, but the Puritan men, including her sort of pseudo-father, Mr. Fletcher, are kind of alarmed. And then Janae accuses Nalima of being a witch, and she ends up getting imprisoned, and then Hope helps her to break free, and then that earns Hope a trip to live with the Winthrops in Boston. So I don't know if I made the comparison to the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air last week, but it always kind of reminds me of that. Like, she's a good kid who gets in a little bit of trouble, so they send her to live with the wealthy authoritarians in a more cosmopolitan area. It's not a great parallel, but it's a little bit similar. But again, she's kind of gently chastised by the Puritan power structure at that point, because they recognize that, her deeds were sort of driven by, good impulses, but she's just kind of overstepping her bounds. And she kind of keeps doing that in Volume 2. She speaks freely. She challenges Governor Winthrop in certain ways. And there's some interesting exchanges there where, again, I think we're supposed to gently I think Sedgwick is gently sort of criticizing the Puritans. Again, gently. Not too harshly, but she does, I think, want to make clear that the Puritans get some things wrong, right? They misunderstand, perhaps above all, Native Americans. And we see kind of a repetition of what happens to Nalima later in Volume 2 with Magawiska, when she's accused by Sir Philip, wrongfully accused of both kind of being satanic and perhaps helping to kind of organize armed resistance to the English. And she gets imprisoned. And Hope, once again, defies the local rules to try to help break her free with the assistance of Everell. So we see other characters help her. In Volume 1, Digby, the elderly servant of the family, helps her to break Nalima out. So again, we're reminded that what Hope is doing, it's not really wrong. It's the Puritans who are kind of wrong. The Puritans are wrong to imprison these Native American women. And again, notice that both of the prisoners are women, Native American women, and notice that the reasons they're locked up are kind of similar. The reasons stem largely from ignorance and a misunderstanding on the part of the Puritans. And Sedgwick kind of spells that out. She kind of points that out. I think, at various times. You should look for that, particularly in the trial scene. I believe that's chapter 9, when Magawiska's on trial, and then I think by the next chapter, she's locked up. So kind of pay attention to some of the commentary that Sedgwick offers there, because, again, she wants to sort of point out that the Puritans weren't always right or justified in their dealings with the Native Americans. And that was kind of somewhat revolutionary. Again, like I said last time, she's kind of retelling the history of Puritan New England, and she's kind of re-examining the existing historical narratives, which of course were very pro-Puritan, pro-English, and anti-Native American, and she's kind of rewriting the history, trying to be more accurate, and trying to point out that actually, a lot of the bloodshed, a lot of the conflict really was sort of started, instigated, created by the English. I forgot to mark this one down, but there's a very brief mention at some point kind of late in the book where she says it was the unfortunate habit of the English to take advantage, or the melancholy habit. I can't remember how she describes it, but she points out that whenever there was tension or rivalries or sort of, bad blood between various Native American tribes, the English always took advantage of that. They would always sort of jump at the opportunity to pit the various Native American groups against one another. Well, that's exactly what we saw on Hiko Tenkettle, right? We saw the Spaniards do that. They would recruit smaller tribes that wanted to knock off the big empire, and that's how they were able, in large part, to ultimately defeat the Aztecs. So that's happening on a smaller scale in New England. Of course, we don't have the huge population centers here that we saw in central Mexico, or we would have seen in Peru about 100 years prior to the time period here. But it's the same basic colonizing tactic. Use the existing rivalries of the Native Americans against them to sort of, pit them against one another, thin their numbers, and that ultimately helped the English to kind of isolate the most hostile tribes, the tribes that were the most hostile to them. And then they could weaken them by sort of gathering other tribes to help them fight the hostile groups. So again, Sedgwick is acknowledging that. She doesn't dwell on it, you'll notice. She just kind of throws it out there, acknowledges it, and then kind of gets back to the events of the plot. But it's interesting. She's threading this needle, like I said, kind of trying to find this middle ground. So I found a couple of other examples. One is on page 204. So this is chapter 2 of volume 2. Not a very long passage, just the bottom paragraph on page 204. Again, she doesn't often dwell on some of these points, but she does acknowledge them more freely than most American writers of the time period would have. So look at the bottom of 204. This is at a point in the narrative where she's describing that there's kind of this effort by some other Native American groups in New England to band together, form a confederation to rise up and try to push the English out. And again, this is based on real historical fact. This was a process that would continue over the next several decades. I might have mentioned last week King Philip's War, which broke out in the 1670s. And that was kind of the definitive and final major armed conflict in New England between English settlers and Native Americans. So that happens about 30 years after the events that we're seeing here in Hope Leslie. But that was very much kind of what she's describing here. Several tribes led by the Narragansetts and maybe the Wampanoags. I can't remember all the alliances because they were very complex, but there was a powerful confederation of tribes that banded together and almost succeeded in pushing the English out. That war was the outcome was in doubt initially. The English eventually won, of course. This was in the 1670s. By the end of that war, the English sort of dominance of the region was assured. So this is a historical development that's going to continue to kind of play out for several decades. But at the bottom of the page, Sedgwick kind of goes on to say, had the Indians been capable of a firm combination, the purpose of Monadnock, bringing together this confederation of tribes, might have been achieved, and the English had been then driven from the American soil. But the natives were thinly scattered over an immense tract of country, the different tribes divided by petty rivalships and impassable gulfs of long transmitted hatred. They were brave and strong, but it was brute force without arms, without art or arms. They had ingenuity to form, and they did form, artful conspiracies, but their best concerted plans were betrayed by the timid or the treacherous. So this is kind of a complex rhetorical move that she's making here. Again, she's giving some credit to the Native Americans, which might not seem like much to us, but in the 1820s, it was significant. So she says they're brave, they're strong, and they could come up with some pretty good plans. But their large-scale plans, she says, always failed because of these rivalries, because not all the tribes got along. They couldn't really form the kind of strong alliances that they needed in order to defeat the English. And she's not, totally wrong about that. I mean, I think she's oversimplifying it. I don't think it's because there were too many timid or treacherous people involved. I think it had a lot more to do with technology and numbers. I mean, but she does kind of tap into some truth when she mentions that the Native Americans in this part of North America were kind of thinly scattered across a large area of land. So if you remember, when we were talking about Hicotinquetl, I mentioned some Latin American historians who have kind of reminded us in recent years, and people in the U.S. need to be reminded of this because we're not really taught this in the U.S., but the fact that it was really Spanish America that was the dominant colonial force in the 15 and 1600s. And then by the 1700s, British America, or, North America, kind of surpassed Spanish America in terms of wealth and strength. But that's a long ongoing process. And in the middle of the 1600s, where we are here, that process has not played out yet. So one of the big kind of, rediscoveries that we've made is that the big population centers, as we saw with Hicotinquetl, the really big Native American population centers were largely found in Central and South America, places like Central Mexico and Peru. In North America, due to a variety of factors that we can't get into right now, and I'm no historian, but just based on what little I do know, geography, weather, a lot of factors, but typically the Native Americans in the future U.S., they didn't have generally the kinds of urbanized large population centers that we saw in Central Mexico. They were more spread out. They didn't practice as much large-scale agriculture, though of course there were exceptions. But that's part of the dynamic that made initially British America less populated and less affluent than Spanish America, because unfortunately for the Native Americans, they provided huge unpaid workforces for the Spanish in these major population centers. Once the Spanish, were able to succeed militarily, they had huge populations that knew how to grow crops. These were very centralized, organized, sophisticated, urbanized civilizations. And the Spanish kind of had that existing infrastructure to build on. Whereas, and to exploit, of course, we know they did. And in North America, it's just kind of a different deal. A lot of similarities, but because the Native Americans were more spread out, and many of them And certainly in New England, there wasn't a lot of large-scale agriculture. They weren't as sedentary, the populations. Of course, again, there were exceptions. I'm speaking very generally, but these are trends that historians have noticed. And they pointed out that in some ways, the more spread out nature of the Native Americans made it initially a bit easier, perhaps, for the British, for relatively small groups of English settlers like the Puritans in New England to experience military victory, because you didn't have the kind of concentrated populations and really organized fighting forces that you would have seen with the Tlaxcalans and other groups in central Mexico. But there was just a lot more ground to cover. And of course, the subjugation of Native Americans in the future U.S., once it became the U.S. Again, as I mentioned, this was a several 100-year long project. This is kind of where it's playing out first. New England is kind of the first scene of Native American extermination, large-scale Native American conflict, and this is a narrative that gets played out in various other regions at future points in time. So again, just to kind of keep in mind that Sedgwick is drawing on some historical fact, but she's also generalizing and essentializing, and like Rowson before her, and like a lot of frontier romance writers, she ultimately wants to privilege the Europeans, right? She wants to establish that Native Americans it is possible for Native Americans to possess some of the noble qualities of white people, but it's relatively uncommon. But she also points out that a lot of the English superiority does come from technology and just more advanced weaponry. So if you go way ahead into chapter 7, we'll just kind of go through this very quickly. Another similar passage at the very end of the chapter, the final paragraph. She's talking about Everill and Magawiska and their very platonic, pure relationship that's not romantic, because Sedgwick isn't really endorsing, interracial marriage here. But she talks about how Everill, how they just both have a lot of regard for one another. They care deeply for one another. But what's interesting is when she talks about what, obviously, Magawiska has given up her arm for Everill. But we also learned that Magawiska feels like Everill has given her a lot as well. She had done and suffered much for him, and she felt that his worth must be the sole requital for her sufferings. She felt, too, that she had received much from him. He had opened the book of knowledge to her, had given subjects to her contemplative mind beyond the mere perceptions of her senses, had in some measure dissipated the clouds of ignorance that hung over the forest child and given her glimpses of the past and the distant. But above all, he had gratified her strong national pride by admitting the natural equality of all the children of the Great Spirit, and by allowing that it was the knowledge of the Englishman, an accidental superiority, that forced from the uninstructed Indian the exclamation, Manitou, Manitou, he is God. So this, again, a very kind of complex rhetorical move that she's making here, saying on one hand that the Native Americans need instruction, right? Very condescending, I think, in many ways, to refer to Magawiska as an ignorant forest child that needs a white person to teach her, the books and the European traditions that Everill was undoubtedly teaching her. So she's referencing an early period in their lives when they were still kids, living in the Fletcher household. So that's kind of a condescending move. But then notice that it's not just, she got some book learning from Everill. Also, she gets a sense of national pride from Everill because he confirms that all humans are equal. He's sort of subscribing, like Sedgwick, to this kind of universal idea of the kind of inherent worth of all of God's children. It's kind of a Unitarian idea. But again, we know that Everill's not really a doctrinaire Puritan either. He's been in England. He doesn't mind to have a glass of wine now and again. He's a bit more progressive in some ways as well in his own right. So both he and Hope are kind of more like 19th century Unitarians than they would be like 17th century Puritans, and that's very much by design. But again, an interesting move to point out that Everill's biggest contribution to Magawiska is to make her proud of her own Native American identity. But again, notice that she needs a white person to make her feel good about being a Native American. So it's a gesture that I don't think carries as much weight for us as modern readers, because we see how sort of problematic it is to characterize Magawiska as an ignorant forest child who didn't fully understand her own worth until Everill came along and made it clear to her. But this is another attempt to kind of advocate for the humanity of Native Americans, and Everill is also advocating for that. Hope also advocates for that. So that's a way that we know those characters are right, and we know that sometimes the Puritans are actually kind of wrong. But again, the criticism isn't harsh, and we see Winthrop and other Puritans. They kind of come around in various ways to kind of they see some of that inherent worth in Magawiska, and even with their treatment of Hope, they're kind of indulgent to a certain extent. But again, it's an interesting balancing act. I think Sedgwick probably wants us to sometimes think that Hope is maybe a little too headstrong. And maybe a little childish maybe at times, but then we're also supposed to think that the Puritans are a little bit too restrictive at times, and they're a little bit prejudiced, and they don't really understand Native Americans. So it's kind of an interesting middle ground that she's trying to stake out. So yeah, we talked about the romantic intrigue. Again, the love triangle, Esther kind of is the odd person out, but again, we have all these misunderstandings that fuel the plot, and eventually we kind of come to an understanding. So we have a lot of elements of domestic fiction here, or sentimental fiction. Again, a lot of melodrama, mistaken impressions, Everill's jealous of Sir Philip, Hope's jealous of Esther, and then everything kind of gets worked out. But this is first and foremost a frontier romance, so she is blending genres. I think we see a little bit of the seduction plot and the figure of Sir Philip. Again, we might view him as sort of a rake, a little bit like Sandford, but even more villainous. For sure. And of course, he's a supporter of the king. He's not a real Puritan. He's not sympathetic to their cause. So we're meant to distrust him from the start. So again, he's a throwback to medieval romance, the pre-novelistic romance. There are elements of the sentimental novel, because a lot of Volume 2 revolves around that love triangle and the sort of coming of age of Hope, which would often be the subject matter for a sentimental novel, the coming of age of a young woman, navigating the search for a husband, all the other trials and tribulations that come with growing up. So we get all of that. But we also have a frontier romance, and we never stray too far from that genre. So in Chapter 5, we kind of get back to the frontier action. Hope has one of these meetings with Magawiska, but now we see Hope's long-lost sister, who was previously known as Mary, but was renamed, I think, in the Fletcher household, so now she's Faith. It gets a little confusing. But remember, Faith has been living with the Pequots all this time, and she's fallen in love with Oneko, the brother of Magawiska. So there is an interracial marriage in the book, but it's not exactly like officially approved. And it involves these minor characters that we're not meant to care as much about. But I just wanted to point out, again, I think this probably weakens Sedgwick's larger mission. But she does it very deliberately. When we meet Hope's sister again, notice the change that's occurred in her. So this happens in Chapter 5 between pages 238 and 240. I'm especially interested in 240. we're meant to think that, Hope's sister, because she's lived with Native Americans and kind of adopted their culture, she doesn't speak English, she's kind of lost her identity as an English woman. And we're meant to look at that as pretty much a bad thing. So her face is described as pale and spiritless, and it was only redeemed from absolute vacancy by an expression of gentleness and modesty. So she's not villainous, but she barely recognizes her sister. She's vacant. She's passive. She has no spirit. And she's meant to be contrasted to Hope, who, of course, has a lot of spirit, a lot of energy, a lot of passion, and Faith, her sister, is just kind of a lot of the humanity, maybe even, has been kind of taken out of her. So kind of a negative portrayal in some ways. And even Oneko, even though he's not really villainous, he's sort of capricious, right? He's depicted as kind of childlike. And they're kind of a good pair because they're both kind of vacant. They're not depicted as being, deep thinkers. And they're kind of both deficient. Right? We even hear that Monanato is kind of disappointed in his son because his son doesn't really have the substance that Magawiska has. So again, how do we want to read this? Is this kind of Sedgwick falling back into the familiar anti-Native American prejudice that would have been, of course, incredibly common during this time period, and basically saying, yeah, there are some noble Native Americans, but if a white person lives with Native Americans for a long time, it's bad news? Or is it just more that these are kind of thoughtless, capricious characters who aren't as noble as, Hope or Magawiska? Is it not so much a racial thing? Is it more is just that Faith and Oneko are just not the equals morally or intellectually of the main characters? I don't know. It's worth thinking about. But again, this is a frontier romance, so we do get a lot of action, In that same chapter, Hope is sort of kidnapped briefly because, remember, Sir Philip finds out about this meeting, so he alerts the rest of the Puritans. They show up thinking that trouble's brewing. Oneko thinks that Hope has betrayed him, so he takes her as a hostage. Again, a common practice. We get another in the Native American settler warfare. We talked about this. They would often, both sides would take hostages and ransom them. So we have a little bit of that, and then in the next chapter, Hope is able to escape. She comes across the drunk sailors. She gets a boat. She gets some help from the Italian who thinks she's a saint. It's actually kind of exciting. There's a lot going on. But Hope, of course, saves herself after a very brief captivity. And then Sir Philip is always scheming. He ultimately is trying to kidnap Hope with the help of these debauched sailors. And again, the sailors are based on real people, a group under Chaddock, who really was sort of banished from Boston because the Puritans found them to be, godless and drunken. So we're getting some real history. We're getting some real historical figures sprinkled throughout this, including Thomas Morton, who was another real figure from history. That's who Sir Philip is supposed to be kind of coming out here to join. So a little bit like Ralston. Again, historical fiction with that frontier romance bent. We have the mixing of fact and fiction. And then at the end, again, more events. So we have a ship exploding. Sir Philip thinks that he's going to get away with Hope, but we have an example of mistaken identity, some improbable events, again, sort of reminiscent of older romances or sentimental fiction, where we'd have a lot of, sort of improbable plot developments. Janae plays a big role. She's mistaken for Hope. So she is blown up at the end, along with Sir Philip and the very unfortunate Rosa, a character that I think we should think more about. I haven't talked about her a lot, but remember, she's the former lover of Sir Philip who's posing as his male, young boy page. And she's an interesting kind of figure that I'm not sure Sedgwick knows exactly what to do with. But they get killed in the blast, and, that's kind of the end. But the final thing I want us to consider is Esther. because eventually it dawns on her that Everill's not really in love with her. He's in love with Hope. And again, it's kind of weird because Hope and Everil kind of grew up like brother and sister, but remember, they're not actually related. But they kind of have a relationship that, at least early in the book, is often described as somewhat like a brother-sister relationship, but then they fall in love. Esther makes the decision to go to England to kind of attend to some family business, but then she eventually comes back. So she removes herself and allows the two of them to get married. So kind of a selfless gesture. Typical of her character. She's very godly. She's a counterpoint to Hope. So while Hope and Magawiska kind of defy authority, but only in morally justifiable ways, of course, but they're still somewhat defiant and rebellious, Esther is not. Right? Esther is sort of the portrait of duty and just, constant benevolence. So she removes herself, ending the triangle, allowing our two lovers to unite. But then she comes back to Massachusetts later and never marries. This is actually the final thing that we learn if you go to the very end. And this kind of brings us back to Sedgwick and her own life. Talking about Esther, her hand was often and eagerly sought, but she appears never to have felt a second engrossing attachment. So she was into Everil, but she's not interested in anything after Everil. The current of her purposes and affections had set another way. That's interesting, kind of vague. The purposes and affections had set another way. She illustrated a truth which, if more generally received by her sex, might save a vast deal of misery. That marriage is not essential to the contentment, the dignity, or the happiness of woman. Marriage is not essential. Kind of a revolutionary message for this time period. And just thinking about Sedgwick herself, in real life, she never married. So this just makes me think of the coquette. When she says if more women knew this, we'd have a lot of people saved from pain and misery. Is she talking about someone like Eliza? Would it have benefited Eliza to have the same viewpoint as Esther and to decide that marriage is not essential? Now, are there certain class and financial considerations that perhaps Sedgwick is not mentioning here? Possibly. But it is an interesting message after we kind of concluded with the coquette that women didn't have much of a choice. They had to marry, especially middle-class women who didn't have a lot of money coming to them, like Eliza. So is this a new path forward? Is this a new option, a new sort of vision for femininity in the U.S.? Sedgwick is doing something interesting with the Esther character, and it might not be a mistake that we end with Esther, right? She's the character we conclude with, even though by this point, Magawiska's gone off to live with her people, Hope and Everil are together, so everything else has been resolved, but the final thing we get is Esther's choice, which would have been a fairly unconventional choice for that time period. Sedgwick's choice was viewed as a bit unconventional. She too had offers of marriage, and she turned them down. So just think about that. And a couple of final questions. I mentioned last time, do we have a Columbia figure in this book? Remember the Columbia figure? I mentioned it in reference to Reuben and Rachel, that kind of personification of America that appeared in a lot of 18th and 19th century art, originally appeared as a Native American woman, and then later increasingly appeared as a white woman. Who's Columbia here? Is it Hope? Is it Magawiska? Or are we supposed to split the difference between the two of them and sort of arrive at some kind of middle ground? And also, is Sedgwick sort of providing an alternate vision of not only history, not only American history, but also the role of American women? Is she trying to sort of reposition American women? Is this kind of a proto-feminist text? Some critics say yes, some critics say no. You guys should arrive at your own opinions. So that's it. We're finished with Hope Leslie. We'll come back next week and talk about Washington Irving, a little bit of Lydia Maria Child, and I might have one or two authors. We're going to read several short works and cover a lot of ground next week. So I'll see you then.